Hello, this is Mr. Janosiak coming to you from my home. Today, Chapter 9, Section 2, Part 1, Patterns of Intergroup Relations. Our main idea is that understanding the concepts and causes of discrimination and prejudice are key to understanding major patterns of minority group treatments. Some questions to consider. How do discrimination and prejudice differ? Which approaches do sociologists use to explain the sources of discrimination and prejudice? What are the most common patterns of minority group treatment? Today, we will be dealing with those first two questions, and tomorrow we'll be focusing on the common patterns of minority group treatment. So, join me, will you? The inequality experienced by minority groups is not unique to the American experience. In fact, sociologists have identified a number of common features and patterns of interaction that characterize relationships between dominant and minority groups across the globe. Discrimination and prejudice, for example, are two common features to the minority group experience worldwide. Although these terms are often used interchangeably, discrimination and prejudice are two separate but related conditions. Discrimination is the denial of equal treatment to individuals based on their group membership. By definition, discrimination involves actions. Prejudice is an unsupported generalization about a category of people. Prejudice refers to the attitudes that one group holds toward other groups. Discrimination can occur on an individual level or on a societal level. Discriminatory acts by individuals range from name-calling and rudeness to acts of violence. In their most extreme forms, such acts lead to physical harm or even death. For example, between 1882 and 1970, more than 1,170 African Americans were lynched by white mobs in the United States. In many cases, those lynched had committed no crime. Rather, they were attempting to vote, use the same public facilities as white Americans, or had become financially successful. Societal discrimination can take one of two forms: legal discrimination or institutionalized discrimination. Legal discrimination is upheld by law. The apartheid system in South Africa is an example of legal discrimination. South Africa had an elaborate system of laws that distinguished the political, economic, and legal rights of white South Africans from non-white South Africans. Many other countries, including the United States, have had systems of legal discrimination. For example, the Jim Crow laws passed in southern states during the late 1800s required African Americans and white Americans to use separate public facilities and to attend separate schools. This so-called separate but equal doctrine was upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson. In 1954, the court reversed its decision, with the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision. Because legal discrimination is based on laws, it can be stopped by changing the offending laws. So, Brown v. Board ruled that separate but equal schools were no longer legal, and then you got integration in America's public school system, and then from there, every other kind of public and private institution was integrated throughout the United States from the 60s and on. Institutionalized discrimination, on the other hand, is an outgrowth of the structure of a society. Over time, unequal access to resources can push minority groups into less powerful positions in society. Once this occurs, it is not necessary for the dominant group to intentionally discriminate against minority groups. Rather, discrimination and inequality become a part of the social structure to the extent that they become self-perpetuating. This makes institutionalized discrimination extremely difficult to change. For example, consider what can happen when minority groups are denied access to jobs and housing. Over time, group members may become concentrated in low-income communities. If schools in these communities are poorly funded, students may not acquire the skills needed to compete effectively in the labor market, and, as a result, they may have fewer opportunities for advancement. In such a case, inequality becomes a cycle that is difficult to break. Just kind of one thought here. Some sociologists and social scientists make the argument that America's school system is actually, at least equal to the segregation of the 1960s, because you have concentrations of racial groups in certain communities. Those schools have a certain racial makeup. They are usually in poor communities, and then you get a self-perpetuating cycle of poverty and non-access to better lives in America. Maybe that's what our assignment will be about on Wednesday. Not sure yet. Prejudice. Negative forms of prejudice often involve stereotypes. A stereotype is an oversimplified, exaggerated, or unfavorable generalization about a group of people. When stereotyping, a person forms an image of a particular group and then applies that image to all members of the group. For example, saying all Irish people are hot-tempered is a stereotype. If individuals are found to differ from the stereotype, they are thought to be exceptions to the rule, rather than proof that the stereotype is wrong. Stereotyping can have grave consequences for society. If people are told often enough and long enough that they or others are socially, mentally, or physically inferior, they may come to believe it. It does not matter whether the accusations are true. American sociologist W.I. Thomas recognized this phenomenon in his famous theorem. If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. In other words, people often act based on what they believe to be true, not necessarily on what is true. Building on Thomas's work, sociologist Robert K. Merton proposed that a stereotype could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a prediction that results in behavior that makes the prediction come true. If members of a minority group are considered incapable of understanding technical information, they may not be given technical training. As a result, they will lack the skills needed to gain employment in highly technical occupations. This lack of employment in technical fields will then be taken as proof of this group's inability to understand technical information. Right? If you tell yourself you can't do something and then you don't do it, and then the thing doesn't get done, you have just created a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can't play soccer. So I don't practice, I don't learn, I don't train. Therefore, I then don't play soccer. I have now self-fulfilled the prophecy that I made myself. For the dominant group in society, prejudice serves as a justification for discrimination. Once people come to believe negative claims about a minority group, they may find it easier to accept open acts of discrimination against the group's members. At times, these prejudicial beliefs can take the form of racism, the belief that one's own race or ethnic group is naturally superior to other races or ethnic groups. Throughout history, racism has been used as a justification for atrocities such as slavery and genocide. Sources of discrimination and prejudice. Various explanations have been offered for the development of discrimination and prejudice. Sociologists often organize these explanations into three broad categories: sociological, psychological, and economic. The sociological explanations. Most sociological explanations of discrimination and prejudice focus on the social environment. This environment includes the accepted norms of a society and the process through which these norms are learned, socialization. In some societies, prejudices are embedded in social norms that describe how members of society are expected to relate to members of certain groups. People become prejudiced simply by internalizing these norms. Think of like a caste system where you have lower classes who you call untouchables, right? And then the norm becomes don't touch that person. And so you then learn prejudice against those people because of the cultural norms. Too far. Even if prejudice is not part of the culture of society at large, it may be a norm of groups within society. People often become prejudiced to maintain their group membership. They may also become prejudiced through their identification with a reference group that encourages and supports such beliefs. This kind of piece makes me think about there's a famous guy, I can't think of his name, which is let's look him up really quick. There's a Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a black man who talks to KKK members, white supremacists, and he's shocked how over and over again a lot of these guys just say like, "Well, I've never talked to a black man before," And so just by him talking to these people, he's able to convert them out of their group identities. But before that, right, these people learn prejudice because of their reference groups and then the group they belong to, which, right, you have all these preconceived notions of other racial groups. You then don't interact with racial groups. Um, and so you learn that prejudice through that sociological explanation of the in-group, out-group dynamic. And Daryl Davis, over and over again, by just kind of talking to and befriending KKK members, helps them get out of their prejudice. But by just being a member of that group, you just learn that behavior. Psychological explanations. By studying individual behavior, psychologists hope to gain a better understanding of prejudice and discrimination. One psychological explanation suggests that people are prejudiced because they have a specific personality type. In a survey of American society, a team of psychologists led by Theodore Adorno found that prejudiced people often show characteristics of what Adorno called an authoritarian personality. Authoritarians are strongly conformist, have a great respect for authority, and are likely to follow the orders of an authority figure. They also exhibit a great deal of anger and tend to blame others for their problems. Another psychological explanation suggests that prejudice may be the product of frustration and anger. When individuals have problems but cannot confront the real causes of those problems, they often turn their frustration and anger on innocent groups. The practice of placing the blame for one's troubles on an innocent individual or group is called scapegoating. The process of scapegoating sometimes gives a people a sense of superiority when they are feeling powerless. A number of social conditions make it likely that racial and ethnic minority groups will become the objects of scapegoating. First, they are easily identified as different because of physical features, language, style of dress, or religious practices. Second, they often lack power in society and may be unlikely to fight back. Third, they may be concentrated in a specific geographic area and therefore are easily accessible and an easy target. Finally, minority groups may have been the target of past scapegoating, so a certain amount of hostility toward them may already exist among members of the dominant group. Economic. According to economic explanations, prejudice and discrimination arise out of competition for scarce resources. For example, during the second half of the 1800s, large numbers of Chinese workers immigrated to the west coast of the United States. In the beginning, they were welcomed as an inexpensive labor source. When jobs became scarce, many white workers began to view Chinese workers as economic competitors. Many white Americans reacted with violence, and in time, laws were passed to restrict Chinese immigration. Conflict theorists suggest that the dominant group, to protect its position, encourages competition for resources among minority groups. This competition creates a split labor market in which workers are set against each other along racial and ethnic lines. In the struggle for jobs, the various minority groups may come to fear, distrust, and hate one another. So that is the first half of this section. Tomorrow we will talk about the different intergroup relations between the dominant groups and minority groups in society. There are 6 of them, and we will do that tomorrow. I hope you are healthy and well. If you have questions, send me an email or drop by my office hours. Healthy Stargates.